The notification came through at 3:47 a.m., right as another contraction hit. Through the haze of labor pain, I saw my phone light up with an email from our bank. Important. Primary account access credentials have been changed. Then another. And another. Chase, Wells Fargo, our investment accounts, even my personal PayPal. All within a 15-minute window while I was writhing in a hospital bed, bringing our daughter into the world. My husband Ian sat in the corner chair, supposedly dozing, his phone face down on his lap. But I'd caught the subtle blue glow reflecting off his glasses just moments before. The same man who'd held my hand through the early stages of labor, who'd whispered reassurances about our future together as a family, had just systematically locked me out of every financial account we shared, and a few that were supposed to be mine alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, in the most vulnerable position a woman could be in, literally bringing his child into the world, and he was executing what he probably thought was the perfect heist. After all, who questions a new father stepping out to handle some urgent business calls while his wife is in labor? Who would suspect a man of financial fraud while he's pacing hospital hallways, playing the anxious dad role to perfection? But Ian had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed I was the same trusting, financially naive woman he'd married 3 years ago. The same woman who'd happily handed over her paycheck each month, letting him manage our finances because he was better with numbers. The same woman who'd smiled and nodded when he'd convinced me to add his name to accounts that had been mine long before I met him. My name is Penelope Morris Jackson. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a senior systems analyst for a cybersecurity firm. Yes, the irony of a cybersecurity expert getting financially manipulated isn't lost on me, but there's a difference between being trusting in love and being stupid in life. For the past 18 months, I've been quietly documenting every red flag, every suspicious transaction, every lie he thought I was too distracted by pregnancy hormones to notice. As Dr. Stevenson checked my cervix dilation and announced I was at 8 centimeters, I felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. Not just the calm between contractions, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that while Ian thought he was checkmating me, I'd been playing an entirely different game for over a year. The labor progressed quickly from there. Ian jumped to attention when the real action started, suddenly the picture of concern and support. He held my hand, fed me ice chips, and told me how proud he was of me. Classic narcissist behavior, loving the performance, the opportunity to be seen as the devoted husband by the medical staff. I watched him play his role perfectly, knowing that in his mind he'd already won. He'd secured the funds, established plausible deniability, who would believe he'd commit financial fraud during childbirth, and positioned himself as the victim of a wife who'd probably just forgotten her passwords due to pregnancy brain. At 6:23 a.m., Isabella Jackson Morris entered the world, all 7 pounds and 4 ounces of perfect innocence. As I held her against my chest, feeling that overwhelming rush of maternal love, I caught Ian's eye over her tiny head. He was smiling, but there was something cold behind it, something calculating. This was the moment that should have cemented our family bond, but instead, I realized I was looking at a stranger. A man who'd chosen our daughter's birth as the perfect cover for betrayal. Dr. Kim, our pediatrician, bustled in to check Isabella while the nurses cleaned me up. Ian stepped outside to call his mother with the good news. Through the window, I could see him on his phone, but his body language was all wrong for a jubilant new father sharing happy news. His shoulders were tense, his voice urgent but quiet. He kept glancing back toward my room like he was checking to make sure I wasn't watching. When he returned 20 minutes later, he was different. Calmer. Like a man who'd just finished important business. He kissed my forehead and told me how beautiful Isabella was, how proud he was of both of us, how our future looked so bright. The performance was Oscar-worthy, except I knew exactly what he'd really been doing during those 20 minutes outside. Truth is, I wasn't surprised by any of this. The signs had been mounting for months, each one more brazen than the last. It started small and taking longer to respond to my questions about our finances, deflecting with jokes about pregnancy brain, when I asked about discrepancies in our statements. Then came the new routines, checking emails in private, taking calls in the garage, suddenly needing to run errands at odd hours that coincided with bank business hours. The first major red flag came 6 months ago when I tried to check our joint savings account online and found my access had been temporarily suspended for security reasons. Ian had brushed it off as a bank error and promised to handle it, but when I called the bank directly, they told me the suspension had been initiated by the account's primary holder, him. That's when I started paying closer attention. His phone habits had changed completely. The man who used to leave his phone lying around carelessly suddenly treated it like it contained state secrets. He'd started sleeping with it under his pillow, taking it to the bathroom, even bringing it into the shower to play music. When I joked about his new phone addiction, he got defensive in a way that felt disproportionate to the comment. Then there were the business trips that didn't quite add up. Ian worked in pharmaceutical sales, a job that required some travel, but suddenly he was having emergency client meetings in cities where his company didn't have major accounts. When I looked up the hotels he'd supposedly stayed at, either they didn't exist or they had no record of his reservations. But the credit card charges were real, and they painted a picture of expensive dinners for two in premium hotel rooms. The most telling change was in how he talked about our future. Before, it had always been we and us. We should buy a house, we need to save for the baby, we should plan for retirement. Gradually it became, I need to secure our future. And, I'm handling the financial planning now. The subtle shift from partnership to control should have been my wake-up call, but I was distracted by pregnancy and genuinely believed he was trying to take care of us. The breaking point came 3 months ago when I found a credit card statement tucked inside one of his work folders. It was an account I'd never seen before, opened in both our names, but with a balance of over $40,000. The charges were damning. Expensive jewelry that I'd never received, romantic dinners at restaurants I'd never been to, hotel stays in cities where I'd definitely never been. When I confronted him about it, he claimed it was a company card he'd been asked to manage for client entertainment. But I work in cybersecurity. I know how to verify information. A quick call to his company's HR department, disguised as a routine benefits inquiry, confirmed that they didn't issue joint personal credit cards to employees. Ian had been living a double life, and I was inadvertently funding it. That's when I decided to stop being a victim and start being strategic. I couldn't confront him directly, not while I was 7 months pregnant and financially dependent on him. Instead, I began quietly documenting everything. Every suspicious charge, every inconsistent story, every strange phone call. I created encrypted files on a secure server at work, photographed statements and documents, and began building a comprehensive case. I also started making my own quiet preparations. I opened a new bank account at a credit union Ian didn't know about, using my maiden name and my mother's address. I began redirecting a portion of my direct deposit there, just enough to build an emergency fund without triggering any obvious changes in our primary accounts. I made copies of important documents and stored them in a safety deposit box he didn't know existed. Most importantly, I started researching divorce attorneys and forensic accountants. I learned about hidden assets, financial fraud, and how to protect yourself when you suspect your spouse is planning to leave you with nothing. I discovered that Ian's behavior fit a textbook pattern of financial abuse and pre-divorce asset hiding. So when those notifications started coming through during labor, when I saw him sitting there with his phone face down, pretending to sleep while systematically locking me out of our financial life, I felt a strange sense of vindication. All those months of preparation, all those nights lying awake wondering if I was being paranoid, none of it had been in vain. Ian had just shown his hand completely, and he had no idea I'd been watching every move. The full scope of Ian's betrayal became clear over the next few hours. While I was being stitched up and learning to breastfeed, I used my phone to systematically check every account I could access. The joint checking account that had held $28,000 the day before was down to 53 cents. Our shared savings account, empty. The investment accounts we built together, liquidated. Even my personal credit card, which had somehow been linked to his access, had been maxed out with cash advances. But the real kicker was discovering that he'd already filed paperwork to dissolve our domestic partnership benefits through his company. The man had covered every angle, from draining our accounts to eliminating my health insurance, all while I was in labor with his child. The level of premeditation was staggering. As I sat there feeding Isabella, calculating the full extent of the damage, I felt a shift in my thinking. The hurt and betrayal were real, but they were quickly being replaced by something else. A cold, analytical fury that reminded me why I was good at my job. Ian thought he was dealing with a vulnerable new mother with limited options. He had no idea he just activated someone with extensive knowledge of financial systems, digital forensics, and exactly how to trace hidden assets. I waited until the nurses finished their rounds and Ian had gone to the cafeteria before making my first call. Not to a family member or friend for emotional support, but to Janet Liu, the forensic accountant I'd been quietly consulting for 3 months. Janet specialized in high-net-worth divorces and financial fraud cases, and she'd been helping me understand exactly what I was dealing with. Penelope. Janet's voice was surprised but immediately focused. Is everything okay? I thought you were in the hospital. I am. I gave birth 4 hours ago, and Ian just executed the plan we've been expecting. I kept my voice low but clear as I walked her through the overnight account changes. Janet listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. Okay, she said finally. This is actually good news in a strange way. He's made this much easier to prosecute. The timing alone is going to make him look like a monster to any jury. But more importantly, he's left a clear digital trail that we can follow. Have you contacted Stephen yet? Stephen Nguyen was the divorce attorney Janet had recommended, a specialist in complex financial cases who'd agreed to represent me when the time came. I'd been hoping to wait until after Isabella was born and I'd had some time to recover, but Ian had just accelerated our timeline considerably. Not yet. I wanted to check with you first about evidence preservation. Smart. Don't touch anything else on your phone or computer until I can walk you through proper documentation. I'm going to call Stephen now and explain the situation. With this level of financial misconduct happening during childbirth, we can probably get emergency injunctions to freeze any remaining assets and prevent him from making any more moves. The conversation lasted only 10 more minutes, but by the end of it, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of control. For too long, I'd been reacting to Ian's deceptions, trying to stay one step ahead of his manipulations. Now, with his most damaging actions finally out in the open, I could stop playing defense and start playing offense. The investigation phase of my life began while I was still in the hospital. Stephen Nguyen arrived that afternoon, professional but kind, carrying a briefcase full of documents and a tablet for taking notes. He was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-30s, with the kind of sharp, focused energy that told me he took cases like mine seriously. First, I'm sorry you're dealing with this right now, he said, glancing at Isabella sleeping in her bassinet. But I have to tell you, the timing of your husband's actions actually works in our favor legally. No judge is going to look kindly on someone who commits financial fraud while his wife is in labor. We spent 2 hours going through everything. Stephen was particularly interested in the documentation I'd already gathered and the timeline of Ian's behavioral changes. When I showed him the encrypted files I'd been building for months, he actually smiled. You've basically done half of our investigative work already. This level of documentation is going to make our case much stronger. But here's what we need to do immediately. We're going to file for emergency relief to freeze all assets and prevent any further transfers. We're also going to request immediate temporary support, since he's left you essentially penniless with a newborn. The legal machinery moved faster than I'd expected. By the end of that day, Stephen had filed motions for emergency asset freezing, temporary spousal and child support, and a full financial investigation. He'd also contacted the banks to report suspected fraud and requested transaction records for all accounts that had been accessed during the previous 48 hours. But it was Janet's investigation that really opened my eyes to the scope of Ian's deception. Using the financial records I'd gathered, plus the new information from the bank records Stephen had subpoenaed, she began mapping out a pattern of financial misconduct that went back almost 2 years. Penelope, this is much bigger than we initially thought, Janet told me during a conference call from my hospital room. The credit card you found? That's just one of 6 accounts he's opened using your information. There are also 2 investment accounts and what appears to be a cryptocurrency wallet that he's been funding with money from your joint accounts. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of 18 months, Ian had systematically diverted more than $180,000 from our shared finances into accounts I'd never known existed. Some of it had funded his double life, the restaurants, hotels, and gifts for someone else. But a significant portion had been moved into investments and crypto holdings that he'd clearly been planning to claim as his own in a divorce. There's more, Janet continued. I've been able to trace some of the spending patterns, and there are regular payments to someone named Melissa Rodriguez. Housing payments, car payments, even what looks like health insurance premiums. I think your husband has been maintaining a second household. The revelation should have been devastating, but instead I felt almost relieved. For months I'd been questioning my instincts, wondering if I was being paranoid or oversensitive. Now I had confirmation that not only had my suspicions been correct, but the reality was actually worse than I'd imagined. The pattern recognition phase of Janet's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Ian's financial behavior followed a specific template that suggested this wasn't his first time doing this. The systematic account opening, the gradual asset diversion, the timing of major moves, it all indicated someone with experience in financial manipulation. A background check Stephen ordered revealed that Ian had been married once before, to a woman named Linda Santos. The divorce records from that case showed eerily similar patterns. Allegations of financial misconduct, hidden assets, and abandonment during a vulnerable period. In Linda's case, Ian had drained their accounts and disappeared, while she was recovering from major surgery. We need to contact Linda, Stephen told me. If she's willing to testify about similar behavior, it establishes a pattern that will make your case much stronger. It also means we might be dealing with someone who's essentially a serial financial predator. Linda Santos turned out to be willing to do more than testify. She wanted to help prosecute. When Stephen's investigator contacted her, she revealed that she'd been trying to track Ian for years, hoping to recover money he'd stolen from her. She'd hired her own private investigator and had been building a case against him, but hadn't been able to locate him until now. He destroyed my life, Linda told me during a phone call a few days after I'd been discharged from the hospital. I lost my house, my credit was ruined, and I spent 3 years just trying to get back on my feet. When I heard what he did to you during childbirth with a newborn, I knew I had to help. Linda's information added crucial context to our case. She confirmed that Ian was skilled at identifying vulnerable women. She'd been dealing with health issues when they met. I'd been grieving my father's death. He had a pattern of presenting himself as a financial savior, gradually taking control of his partner's resources, then disappearing with everything when he'd extracted maximum value. More importantly, Linda had documentation of hidden assets that Ian had never declared in their divorce. Her private investigator had found evidence of offshore accounts and shell companies that Ian had used to hide money. If those assets still existed, they could be recovered as part of our case. The scope of the investigation expanded again when we contacted authorities. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit became interested when they learned about the pattern of behavior across multiple victims and the possibility of interstate fraud. The IRS joined the investigation when Janet's analysis revealed significant unreported income from Ian's hidden investments. What had started as a divorce case was becoming a multi-agency criminal investigation. Ian had gone from being a cheating husband to being the subject of federal fraud charges. The transformation was rapid and comprehensive, like watching dominoes fall in perfect sequence. But it was the discovery of the broader network that really changed everything. The FBI's investigation revealed that Ian wasn't working alone. He was part of a larger group that specialized in targeting professional women, particularly those in tech and finance who had significant assets and income. The group shared information about potential targets and even coordinated their approaches to maximize financial extraction. Agent Penelope Walsh from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit explained it to me during a meeting at the Federal Building downtown. What you've uncovered isn't just personal fraud. It's part of an organized criminal enterprise. These individuals have been operating for at least 5 years, targeting women across multiple states. Your husband was essentially a professional con artist. The investigation team they assembled was impressive. FBI agents, IRS investigators, forensic accountants, and legal experts from multiple jurisdictions. My case had become the key to unraveling an entire network of financial predators who had been systematically destroying women's lives for years. As we built the case, more victims came forward. Women from California, Texas, Florida, and 3 other states, all with similar stories of meeting charming men who'd gradually taken control of their finances before disappearing. The total amount stolen across all victims exceeded $2 million, and that was just what we could document. My role evolved from victim to key witness to unofficial coordinator of the victim network. Because of my background in cybersecurity, I could understand the technical aspects of how the fraud was perpetrated and help other victims document their cases. I became the bridge between the emotional trauma of financial abuse and the cold precision needed to build criminal cases. The evidence-building phase was intensive but oddly therapeutic. Every bank record we recovered, every hidden account we discovered, every lie we documented felt like taking back a piece of my power that Ian had stolen. Janet and I would spend hours going through financial records, mapping the flow of money, identifying the moment when each deception had begun. We discovered that Ian had been planning his exit strategy for over a year. The cryptocurrency investments, the offshore accounts, even the second household with Melissa Rodriguez, everything had been building toward the moment when he would liquidate our shared assets and disappear. My pregnancy had simply provided him with the perfect cover and timing. The digital forensics were particularly revealing. Ian had been careless with his electronic communications, assuming that I would never have the technical knowledge or resources to trace his activities. But with the FBI's help, we recovered deleted emails, text messages, and encrypted communications that laid out the entire conspiracy. There were communications with other members of the group, sharing strategies for emotional manipulation and financial control. There were detailed plans for asset extraction and identity manipulation. Most damaging of all, there were communications between Ian and Melissa that made it clear she was a full partner in the fraud, not just an unknowing beneficiary. As the evidence mounted, our legal strategy crystallized around both criminal prosecution and civil recovery. Stephen filed a comprehensive lawsuit not just against Ian, but against Melissa and the other members of the criminal network. We were seeking not only recovery of stolen assets, but punitive damages for the organized nature of the fraud. The criminal side was even more promising. The federal prosecutors believed they could prove conspiracy, money laundering, identity theft, and multiple counts of fraud across state lines. If convicted, Ian could face 20 to 30 years in federal prison. But the most satisfying discovery came 6 weeks after Isabella's birth, when Janet's investigation revealed that Ian had made a critical error in his planning. In his haste to liquidate our accounts on the night of Isabella's birth, he transferred money into accounts that were already under federal surveillance as part of another investigation. He essentially confessed to the crime in real time, Agent Walsh explained. Every transfer he made that night was recorded and monitored. We have digital evidence of him committing federal fraud while you were in labor. No defense attorney is going to be able to explain that away. The trap was set perfectly, and Ian walked into it exactly as we'd predicted. The confrontation came 3 months after Isabella's birth, during what Ian thought was going to be a routine meeting to discuss our financial future. Stephen had arranged the meeting at his office, telling Ian that we needed to have a formal discussion about supporting Isabella and working out our living arrangements. Ian arrived confident and prepared, carrying a folder of documents that he clearly thought would support whatever story he was planning to tell. What Ian didn't know was that the conference room was equipped with recording equipment, and that FBI agents were waiting in the adjacent office. Stephen had coordinated with federal prosecutors to create a controlled environment where Ian would be given the opportunity to either confess or lie about his activities under oath. The meeting started exactly as Stephen had planned. He presented Ian with a basic financial disclosure form and asked him to list all assets, accounts, and income sources. Ian's response was a masterclass in deception. He claimed that our accounts had been hacked, that he'd been trying to protect our assets, and that he was just as much a victim as I was. "I've been working with our bank to recover the stolen funds," Ian said, looking directly at me with what seemed like genuine concern. "Penelope, I know this has been hard on you, especially with the baby, but I'm doing everything I can to fix this." Stephen let him continue for nearly an hour, asking careful questions that gave Ian multiple opportunities to tell the truth. Instead, Ian doubled down on his lies, even going so far as to suggest that I might have been compromised by hackers at my own company and unknowingly provided access to our accounts. That's when Stephen played the first card. "Ian, I have documentation showing that you personally initiated the password changes on these accounts. Can you explain why you would do that if you were trying to protect them from hackers?" Ian's confidence wavered for the first time. "I The bank advised me to change the passwords as a security measure. I was going to give Penelope the new ones once we knew the accounts were secure. I see. And when exactly were you planning to share those new passwords? It's been 3 months. The questioning continued, with Stephen methodically presenting evidence that contradicted each of Ian's explanations. Bank records showing the precise timing of the transfers. Communication records proving he'd coordinated the moves in advance. Financial documentation revealing the hidden accounts and shell companies. But the moment that truly broke Ian's composure was when Stephen presented him with printed copies of his communications with Melissa and the other conspiracy members. Emails discussing me as a target and planning the extraction timeline. Text messages about celebrating the successful completion of the operation. Ian, Stephen said quietly, we have 18 months of communications between you and your co-conspirators. We know about the network, we know about the other victims, and we know this was planned from the beginning. The question now is whether you want to cooperate with federal investigators or force this to go to trial. That's when the FBI agents entered the room. Agent Walsh introduced herself and informed Ian that he was under arrest for federal fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. As they read him his rights, Ian looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete shock that his victim had outplayed him. The immediate aftermath of Ian's arrest was surreal but deeply satisfying. Within hours, federal agents had executed search warrants on his office, Melissa's residence, and the storage unit where they'd been keeping documents related to their operations. The amount of evidence they recovered was staggering: detailed records of targets, financial planning documents, and communications with other members of the network. More importantly, the asset recovery began immediately. The federal seizure orders that Stephen had prepared in advance allowed authorities to freeze all accounts that Ian had access to, including the cryptocurrency wallets and offshore investments. The money was still there. Ian hadn't been able to complete his escape plan because his arrest had happened faster than he'd anticipated. Within a week, I had access to emergency funds that allowed me to focus on caring for Isabella without worrying about basic necessities. Within a month, the majority of our stolen assets had been identified and were in the process of being returned. The financial devastation that Ian had intended to leave me with had lasted less than 90 days. But the most meaningful part of the resolution was the impact on other victims. Linda Santos was able to recover assets that had been stolen from her 6 years earlier. The women from other states who'd been targeted by the network were able to use our evidence to pursue their own cases. In total, more than $2 million in stolen assets were recovered and returned to victims. The criminal proceedings moved quickly once Ian was in custody. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation led to the arrest of 8 other members of the network and the recovery of additional stolen assets. Ian ultimately pled guilty to 15 federal charges and received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, with a requirement to pay full restitution to all victims. Melissa received 8 years for her role in the conspiracy. The other network members received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement. But perhaps more importantly, the case led to significant improvements in how financial institutions handle suspected domestic fraud. The pattern of behavior we documented became the basis for new detection algorithms that banks now use to identify potential financial abuse. Training programs for bank employees now include specific guidance on recognizing signs of domestic financial control and how to provide resources to victims. My life transformed completely in the aftermath of Ian's arrest. I was able to buy a house for Isabella and me, using money that Ian had stolen and hidden, but that was ultimately recovered through the federal investigation. I changed my name back to Penelope Morris and began rebuilding my identity separate from the person I'd been with Ian. Professionally, my experience led to a new career focus. I began consulting with law enforcement agencies on financial fraud cases, using my technical background to help investigate complex digital crimes. The work was challenging but deeply meaningful. I was helping other victims get justice while using my skills to prevent future crimes. Isabella thrived in our new environment. She was too young to understand what had happened, but she grew up in a home free from the tension and deception that had characterized the last year of my relationship with Ian. She was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her welfare rather than viewing her as a tool for manipulation. The other victims became an extended network of mutual support. We stayed in touch, sharing resources and advice, celebrating legal victories and personal milestones. Linda Santos became particularly close. She was like a sister who'd survived the same war and understood the unique challenges of recovery from this type of betrayal. 3 years later, I received a letter from Ian in federal prison. It was an apology of sorts, though it read more like something written to impress a parole board than a genuine expression of remorse. He claimed to have found religion and wanted to make amends for the harm he'd caused. I read it once and then threw it away. Some people deserve forgiveness, but they have to earn it, and Ian never put in the work. The broader impact of our case continued to expand over time. Congressional hearings on financial fraud referenced our case as an example of how domestic abuse and organized crime could intersect. New federal legislation strengthened protections for victims of financial domestic violence and improved coordination between agencies investigating these crimes. Several law schools now use our case as a teaching example in courses on criminal law and victim advocacy. The systematic way we built evidence and coordinated between civil and criminal proceedings has become a model for other complex fraud cases. Most meaningfully, a victim support organization was established using funds recovered from the criminal network. The Penelope Morris Foundation provides emergency financial assistance and legal resources to victims of domestic financial abuse, particularly women with children who need immediate help to establish independent lives. Looking back now, I can see that Ian's betrayal, devastating as it was intended to be, actually freed me from a life that was slowly destroying me. His attempt to leave me powerless and vulnerable instead forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I had, and to build a life that was genuinely my own. Isabella is 5 now, smart and curious and completely uninterested in the drama that surrounded her birth. She knows her father is away, and that he made some bad choices, but her daily reality is filled with love, stability, and opportunity. She's growing up understanding that people who love you don't hurt you, and that when someone does hurt you, there are ways to get help and get justice. The most important lesson I learned from the whole experience is that being a victim doesn't have to be a permanent identity. Ian chose to see me as vulnerable and exploitable, but vulnerability and strength aren't mutually exclusive. The same circumstances that made me a target, my trust, my focus on building a family, my willingness to put someone else's needs first, also gave me the motivation and clarity to fight back effectively. Every time I look at Isabella, I remember that the night she was born was the night Ian revealed who he really was. But it was also the night I began to discover who I really was. His betrayal was meant to be my ending, but it turned out to be my beginning. And that's a lesson worth passing on.